I moved to LA straight out of high school to be a session guy. At that time, it was 1977. And at that time, being a session guy in LA was a real job. It was like it was like winning if you got to do that. And I wanted to live anywhere but the town I grew up in, this tiny town in Mississippi. And so that was my way to do it. I was a guitar player. I figured if I was good enough, I could move here and then I'd get to stay here because I would do that. And it worked. And I was pretty successful doing that. And did that, I don't know, for maybe 6 years, something like that was my 100% focus. I didn't know anybody when I moved here, so I got gigs out of the back of the recycler. Like, I mean, people would advertise needing free musicians, like to be in a band or to play at a wedding or whatever. So I just did anything. I would call nearly any listing that was guitar player related, and I would go do anything. It was just, come play at my brother's funeral, sure. I'd go play acoustic guitar at somebody's. I did that once. It was weird. And I got in a band. One of the things that came from that was I got in this band I auditioned for and got in this band called Epicure. It was all instrumental with a guy who read poetry over it. And it was Skipper Wise's band who ended up forming the mic company Blue, right? Yeah, Blue Mics. And it was Skipper's band, and they had a house gig going at the Troubadour every Monday night because they had so many friends here who would come to the shows that it was worth it for the Troubadour. But the music was just weird. I mean, it was completely weird, just 20-minute guitar solos, stuff like that. But there were some nights where Bonnie Raitt would open for us at the Troubadour, some of those Mondays. And her band were like real guys, like the Hodge brothers. There were a bunch of real, Freebo, a bunch of real musicians in that band. And here I am up there, the headliner, playing these long guitar solos with some guy reading poetry over them. But some of those guys, after 2 or 3 nights of this happening, some of those guys come up and talk to me, and they're like, "Man, you play really good. What are you doing?" I go, "Oh, I'm doing sessions." And they go, "Yeah, who are you do?" I go, "Well, I'm not doing any yet, but that's what I want to do. I want to do sessions." They go, "Well, we do a lot of that." They go, "Would you want to come maybe do things like that with us?" Or something. I go, yeah. They go, "Give us your number." And that was really good. And one of those guys had a band that played somewhere and did instrumental stuff, saxophone player. And he called me up and goes, "You want to come and play with the band tonight? One of the guys can't do it. So it'll be you and another guitar player." And I go, "Sure." And so I go to do that. And he goes, "You can read, right?" And I go, yeah. And so it was just like no rehearsal, anything. And so I go to this bar to do that gig, and the other guitar player was Dean Parks in this guy's band. And Dean was quiet but super nice and was real complimentary about my playing. Dean, if you don't know, man, is just LA legend session guitar player. That's the job I wanted. And Dean, I tell Dean that, and he's just like, "Oh man, sure, I'll help you out. Let's do some sessions. Come do things with me." I go, "Okay." So that was probably my first one I remember. But there were 2 or 3 around the same time, different little avenues into getting into the real music business that happened at the same time. That's the first one I just thought of, though. The great thing about being like a session guy was getting to play on a lot of great projects, high visibility, getting paid projects with great musicians. I mean, that, your peers is like amazing. The downside is you really, if you have a lot of opinions about what better music is and worser music is, the session guy isn't the guy who's really supposed to have those opinions. And as I kind of got, used to being a session guy, I got more and more comfortable and more kind of in touch with my opinions about music. And I played on Madonna stuff, for example, but then I played on probably 30 different records of people record companies hoped would become Madonna, and they both paid the same. You know what I mean? And so you would do them, you're a session guy. But you're sitting there and you're copying a Madonna song. And at some point you kind of go, well, I'd sure like to just be doing the Madonna songs. and not be doing the copies of Madonna songs. You know, and I had a lot of the great musicians I was around weren't hung up by those sort of things. They just showed up and were having a great time being music people and getting paid for it, you know, having really good livings. And for me, over time, I just started to kind of realize that I was going to have to make my peace with that. If I was going to be a musician my whole life in this way, I was going to have to learn to really be comfortable, you know what I mean, like to not be hung up about that. Yeah. Or I should shift my job to where I get to pick what I work on. And so I started, people were kind of hitting me up to produce things and, hey, could you help me make this? And some reason I sort of had that inclination where people would pick up on that and get me to help and stuff. And that's how I just graduated. And at some point there was one day where I got home from doing a session and I go, not doing it anymore. Every time somebody calls, I'm going to say I'm already booked. Because I'm not going to tell anybody I'm just quitting, but I'm just quitting. And I go, I'm going to concentrate on producing. I'm going to put a little studio in my basement. I had a house in the Hollywood Hills, had a cool basement. And I go, I can put a little recording studio in there and fuck around. People didn't have home studios, but that's how I wanted to do it. And I bought a Fostex 8-track. With its own little console, had treble and bass on all 8 channels. And I set about recording things. And I fucked around for about 6 months, just doing stuff, learning how to do different things. Roger Lynn gave me a drum machine, so I had that. I had some different things where I'd just sit and play around. And but I ended up getting the ear of Miles Copeland, who because I'd recorded an all-girl band in my basement because I thought one of the girls was hot. And they played their stuff for Miles, and Miles goes, you want to do some records for IRS? And I go, sure, I'd love to. And he sent me to Texas to see this band play, and I didn't think that he was signing. And I didn't love it. But the opening band I thought was great. And so I came back to Miles, I go, I don't think you should sign the band you're signing. I think you should sign the opening band instead. And he's like, what the fuck? I'm trying to get you to produce a record. You don't even want me to sign the band? What the fuck? What's with you, asshole? And I go, well, it's just how it sounded to me. And he goes, let me check out that band. And he checks them out and he goes, fuck yeah, you're totally right. I'm doing that. He goes, you'll do it in your basement, right? And I go, yeah. Okay. So I made, that was my first real album. Made that in my basement. And it was this band called Timbuk 3. We had a hit song called The Future's So Bright, I Gotta Wear Shades. They got nominated for a Grammy, and I was a producer. You know, it was obviously a progression over time. Like, one thing with having, you know, I kind of knew so many people, but by being a studio musician here for 6 or 7 years, I knew tons of engineers, real producers, tech people like Charlie Bolus, all these sort of people. And like, I could tap into that. Things I didn't know how to do or things whatever, I would call them up and go, what's a good compressor? You know, how do you record a kick drum? You know, I'm sitting here in my basement like a moron. You know, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. And I wasn't an engineer, I was a musician, right? But when the Timbuk 3 record did good and everybody starts calling me to do stuff, my first inclination was, well, I got to bail on the Fostex 8-track format, and I should move to 24-track, 2-inch tape format to where I can work anywhere in LA, and then I can always do overdubs at home. I can start something at home and take it to a big studio. I can always, you know, I needed to get in the real world of stuff and still keep my vibe of my little basement feel that I liked and had going. So that's what I did. So I bought a Ampex MM1200 tape machine. I bought some mics. That's when I bought my Fairchild from Alan Sides. That was hilarious. There was just like, I knew all these people like Alan. And so I go, wow, I should get a good compressor. And people keep telling me Fairchilds are good. So I call up Alan, I go, you got any Fairchilds? He goes, oh yeah, I have a great one. I just tested a bunch. He goes, come here, I'll show you. So I go over to Alan's and we listen to the Fairchild. He goes, sounds great, you know. And it seemed like a lot of money then, and now it seems like not as much money, you know. So it just was sort of this accretion of studioing like that. So then I spent a few years in LA making more records and working out of my basement but I might go track at an Ocean Way or somewhere, and then work in my basement and go mix at the Village. You know what I mean? I got it. I was able to be kind of cross-pollinating. But then, you know, I came to this. I started really, after a few years of that, I started really, and I was doing fine, and I felt like I built up kind of a rep and clients and stuff where people might come anywhere, and I was missing the weird Mississippi vibe that I understood really well and had grown up with. So I decided to try relocating the studio to Mississippi. And I did some sussing and figured that out and did it. At first I was going to try to I was an hour from Memphis. And so I figured I could always go track in Memphis or mix in Memphis or whatever. And the guys at Ardent are great, and that's a great studio. There were a couple studios I knew of that were great and I could interact with. But it's just after doing that for a couple of records, I go, I got to be able to track, I think, at my place and mix now, being in a more remote area like I was. And so that's when I thought, I think I need to get a big boy console. I think the time has come. And I was doing a record in LA with Counting Crows. And we were set up in a big house, like, kind of up in the hills someplace, swimming pool, movie stars. And but we had Neve sidecars, and that's how we were recording everything. And it came getting towards mixing time, and they were like, we'd like you to mix it. We like how the rough mixes are sound. The record company, Jimmy Iovine and those people, they liked how the rough mixes sounded. They go, we want you to mix the record. And I go, well, we can't mix on this. And they go, well, let's just go to a studio mix. And I'm like, I don't really, engineer-wise, I don't really want to go to some studio I haven't worked in and mix this. I'm not like a big mixer guy who's used to that, And but I needed a console for my studio in Mississippi at the same time. So the light bulb then was like, what if I buy a console that I need in Mississippi, but I'll probably find it out here anyway in LA, and we can set up and mix on it in this house, and then I'll ship it to Mississippi. You know what I mean? And it'll be my console in Mississippi. And so I called around and just put out the word to people I thought, that I knew, I thought it'd be helpful, that I was looking for a console. And between the big three, between an API and a Trident and a Neve, I felt like an API was the one I could afford. Those are less expensive. And they're good consoles, obviously. They're big three. And so I called, one of the people I called was Brent Averill, who was at the time the Neve guru probably in the world, certainly here in LA. And I go, hey, Brent, just so you know, I'm looking for an API, so if you hear of something. And he was a friend and stuff, and Brent's funny, and I might have told him at dinner one night, I might have said, hey, Brent, I want to get an API. And he goes, oh, okay, I'll put the word out, and I'll keep an eye out. But he calls me a couple weeks later, and he goes, I found a console I like for you. There's a couple of problems with it. And I'm like, what? And he goes, well, one, it's a Neve. And I know you want an API. And I go, well, I'd rather want a Neve. Can I afford a Neve? He goes, well, that's the other problem. It's not for sale. But he goes, it's a Neve, and it's great. And he goes, I'm the only guy that's teched on it. He goes, it was bought, ordered by Wally Hyder at RCA Hollywood, 1970. And in 1980, it left, it went to another guy, and I'm the only guy who's worked for him teching it ever since. So it's just me. I know this console. It's a great console. And he goes, I go, well, yeah, but you said it's not for sale. And he goes, well, the guy should sell it. He's not using it as much as he used to. And he goes, somebody should have it who really just wants to sit and make records like a nincompoop all the time. And I go, well, yeah, that's me. That's what I do. And he goes, yeah. So he goes, let me talk to the guy and see if he'll sell it, and let me see how much he'll take. And then you see if you can afford it. And I go, okay. He calls me back. He goes, okay, I got him talked into it. And he told me the price. I go, well, that's about double what I was thinking it was going to, I would spend on a console, but it's a Neve, huh? And he goes, I'm telling you, Dennis, you're not going to regret having this console. And so I bought it. And that was kind of the growth of the studio from, my little basement to now being a really full-blown thing. Everything else had kind of grown and gotten good all around a small console. But Then you had this big beast of a real console, 1073s and everything. Man,
Awesome.
who didn't walk in the door and get blown away by that? You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Any artist would walk in and go, whoa, you know.